privilege at this point to introduce our speaker beginning for lunch, John Barrett. John is a graduate of Georgetown University, my school, so I'm very proud of that, and Harvard Law School. He's a professor of law at St. John's University Law School, and he is, no exaggeration to say, he is the world's foremost expert on Justice Robert Jackson. He has a blog, the Jackson List, which several years ago I was introduced to. It's fascinating stuff, and John puts it out regularly, giving details about Justice Jackson's life and tying it to bigger picture events that are contemporary and also historical. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Professor John Barrett.
Good morning, friends, and thank you so much to a number of responsible leaders who have brought us here together. I want to thank first John Farmer and Rutgers and the Miller Center, Mr. Miller, for their part of this endeavor. I also want to thank very deeply the March of the Living, an organization that I've been connected to for a little over 2 years. Yesterday was the second opportunity I've had to participate in the march. I got more out of it the second time, and I expect I will march again in future years because it is a perpetually significant, powerful, wrenching, but uplifting educational experience, and it's part of an educational project that, with the recent polls of underexposure and misimpression data that we've just learned about, is an education project that is something that belongs to all of us. It belongs to teachers, it belongs to experts and people who are connected, who are educated students, because really we each have a responsibility to teach forward, to share the knowledge, to raise the questions, to host the conversations, to participate in debate and inquiry. And the March of the Living is at the top of my list of powerful endeavors and fora and undertakings on a topic that matters just enormously and always will. So I thank Richard Heidemann, I thank my friend Dr. David Macklis, who is really the organizational energy and vision that has brought me into the March of the Living and its projects. It's also particularly an honor to speak here at a program that the March of the Living and Rutgers and co-sponsors have named in honor and in memory of Justice Robert H. Jackson. He is my project. I am a writer, a researcher, a biographer of Jackson. I do write the Jackson List, which you can find the archive of at the Jackson List when you Google it. And please give me your email address if you wish to join. It reaches over 100,000 pairs of eyeballs every time I send out a message, and that's a very nice testament to the power and the enduring relevance of Justice Jackson and his life and his work. What I'm going to talk about today is Justice Jackson and the Holocaust. And I want to set up a theme that I will use as I chronicle Jackson's work as a United States government official and then as the American chief prosecutor at Nuremberg as it connects to the Holocaust. The theme is dawning and partial and really never more than partial comprehension of the Holocaust through the process of the work and the discovery that he is involved in as a Nuremberg prosecutor. I want to begin, and generally I will work with a number of slides so we can turn it on. I want to begin, of course, with this figure of evil, and behind him, this city of great beauty. This is Hitler and arrayed sycophantic political supporters in the heart of the Altstadt, the old city of Nuremberg, in Bavaria, in southeastern Germany, in September, I think this is 1935, at one of the annual Nuremberg rallies that the Nazi Party convened there in the Septembers in the 1930s to celebrate and consolidate and build on and advance the internal political movement, achieving government power, achieving consolidation, achieving oppression that Nazism was. They chose Nuremberg, and Dr. Stephen Katz has already pointed to a powerful indication of this, because of bizarre historical continuity that they wished to draw from themselves, the Third Reich, back to Bismarck, the Second Reich, and back to the Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich, which used Nuremberg as a castle city, as a summer home of the emperor. And indeed, the Nazi Party rally grounds, which you can visit in Nuremberg today, they're preserved as a federal documentation center and visit site, is aligned with the castle. So the Great Road in the Nazi Party rally grounds is on a line to the old city of Nuremberg and pointing up to the castle. So physically, the connectivity between the Third Reich and the First Reich, between medieval pageantry and Nuremberg rallies, was part of the Nazi pageantry. This is Dachau, which was the first concentration camp created by the Nazi state in the spring of 1933, very shortly after Hitler comes to power and emergency consolidated unfettered power. And it is a barrack system, and it is a confinement facility. It is for political enemies of the Reich, and it is to dispense with the ordinary processes of law. In other words, this is for preventative detention without the formalities of trial, without the formalities of detailed charging, and of course, without the opportunity to provide argumentation and exculpation with the assistance of lawyers. And over time, this concentration camp, open and known to the world from the beginning, descends into worse and worse conditions and becomes a place of large confinement, grave suffering, and death. All of which is important to distinguish from extermination camps, from death camps, from what Dr. Katz described, the 6 here in the East camps that were designed to be part of an industrial system of murder. What the West saw, and by the West I mean across the ocean, the United States, beginning in the 1930s, was Hitler and Hitlerian rise to power, and a system of political repression, including concentration camps in Germany. And the Red Cross visited, and the reports were generally positive, if not entirely endorsing. And there was an understanding that imprisonment is something that a nation does to the people who run afoul of its procedures. I don't want to say no big deal, but I do mean to say no big comprehension of what path Nazi Germany was beginning to walk along. This is just another glimpse of the pageantry at the Zeppelin field at a Nuremberg rally. This is 1934, which shows large numbers of people assembled. We can't mistake the leaders and the arch criminals for the population of the country. And the Nuremberg trial that I'm going to talk about is, of course, a focus on 24 defendants, the principal individual lead perpetrators of the crimes of Nazism. But political power, consolidation, oppression, what Nazism was, does not come about without mass political support. And a photograph like this captures that image. This is a chart, a eugenicist chart, a madman's chart, embodying the racial Nuremberg laws, which were promulgated and enacted by acclamation at the Nuremberg rally in 1935. The column second to the right is the one I want you to focus on. That identifies who is a Jew. And it is a 3-grandparent rule. But what the chart doesn't quite capture is that the identification of whose one's grandparents were and what they were is not yours or your family's or a matter of your own family history. It's a Nazi classification power. As Hermann Goering, later to become the Reichsmarshal and the lead defendant at the International Nuremberg trial, famously said, "I decide who is a Jew." And that's embodied in this chart, which meant that your grandfather and grandmother, etc., who viewed themselves as German and perhaps Lutheran or non-believer or you name it, could be classified as a Jew by the Nazis, triggering these laws which define non-citizenship, which included bars from professional occupations, including the practice of law and the service of judicial office as of 1935, and then an escalating series of impositions, deprivations, discriminations, and sufferings. This is Poland. Here we are in Poland, beautiful Krakow, 21st century, peaceful, sophisticated, cultured, repaired, Krakow never deeply damaged, but Poland is, of course, where the fighting war started. These are German tanks crossing the border on September 1, 1939. And we know that very quickly the Polish state was defeated. This is the famous photo of a child surrendering in Warsaw, a child whose name we'll never know, and whose fate we don't know literally specifically, but we do know deeply and morally. And that is a part of the expanding oppression and the road to what we begin to understand as Holocaust. This war is a European war. And for the United States, publicized though it is, troubling though it is, and threatening allies though it is politically, in the main, an American perspective that this is not our problem. God, if you will, gave the United States these vast oceans that protected and buffered it and created a public consensus and a politics of isolationism. That's the 1930s. That's the Franklin Roosevelt presidency. That's the condition of a Great Depression being fought as a domestic economic calamity in the United States in that decade. Now, President Roosevelt, whose death, by the way, also was yesterday, so April 12th is a date that has many echoes, not just the March of the Living, but the loss of this president, was aware of these developments, of course, and had, in a careful political way, an ability to begin to articulate what was going on in Europe and to begin to move the country towards a greater military preparedness and eventually a participation in supporting roles, and then following attack and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, American involvement in the war. This is Roosevelt at the famous microphones from which he delivered his fireside chats. And it's not literally the fireside chat of October 1942. I can't find a photo from that exact date. But in October of 1942, in a subtle way, he puts down the first public marker that the European problem is an American problem, and particularly that the European innocent people occupied land suffering problem is an American problem. He very deliberately in his pen adds a phrase about the string of barbed wire being wrapped around the people of Europe, which is, I believe, and circumstantially seems quite connected to, in a subtle way, events like this and the suffering that he was aware of and that was an expanding reality. Now, Pearl Harbor, end of 1941 into 1942, America is in the war, and American economic and military productive capacity becomes part of the fight. And it is inevitable thereafter, once Hitler has attacked the Soviet Union, that the Allies will win. But it's a matter of time and hard fighting, and North Africa in 42. It's not really clear until 1943 that planning for the post-victory is a relevant activity. This is the Moscow Conference of November of 1943. You see Molotov with pen in hand, the Soviet foreign minister, signing the Moscow Declaration. To his left is Anthony Eden. To his right is Cordell Hull, the American Secretary of State. They are signing for their principles for Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin. And the Moscow Declaration contains a provision, highly general, that is the seed of what becomes the Nuremberg trials and the accountability process. The Moscow Declaration of November 1943 commits that internationally these allies will hold the perpetrators accountable following their defeat. In other words, the alliance is not just a war-fighting alliance, but the alliance will be a post-war accountability alliance. It doesn't say trial, it doesn't specify international law, but it contains this idea of international togetherness and the idea that the Nazis have transgressed some fundamental boundary and are culpable for throwing the world, here the European theater, into this cataclysm. This is the Yalta Conference of February 1945, slightly more than a year later. These now are, of course, the principles, and you can see death etched in the face of Franklin Roosevelt. 2 months later, he will be gone. And the Yalta discussions are, of course, a huge topic, and most of it includes the landmass and the people and the future of Europe following the defeat of the Nazis. And of course, a particular topic therein is the fate and the future of Poland. In addition to all of that and all of its enormous complexity, the Yalta Declaration builds on the Moscow Declaration and includes a slightly expanded, reiterated commitment by the Allies to hold the Nazi perpetrators legally now accountable following their defeat. So as we're formulating a Nuremberg trial plan, this is the next step. And then, of course, Roosevelt is gone, and Harry Truman on the left inherits the American presidency. He has this commitment to deliver on. It's April of 1945. The Nazis are about to be defeated. Hitler is about to be captured, along with Himmler, along with Bormann, along with Goering, the inner circle. And the Allies will have to hold them accountable, which becomes a question of what kind of process that will be. And Truman reaches a short distance down Pennsylvania Avenue to the U.S. Supreme Court to recruit the man on the right, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, to be the American chief of counsel, the chief lawyer, to take on that project. Now, a bit about Jackson. Jackson was a Pennsylvanian, born on a farm in humble circumstances in 1892. He was schooled in small-town schools in Pennsylvania and then in New York State. His family had some resources in literacy, but he had nothing fancy. He was self-taught to a large extent, but he had an enormous natural talent and a few special teachers who expanded his horizons with literature and history and economics. And he graduated from high school and then became an apprentice as his path to the practice of law. He never went to college. He never studied for a day in any general higher education beyond high school. He spent 1 year in a law school when he was 19 and turned 20 for a year of book learning, but on either side of that, apprenticed in a two-man law office in southwestern New York State, reading the law. And at age 21 became a lawyer in western New York and practiced for some time in Buffalo, for a longer time in Jamestown, and in a 20-year period rose to be a very leading younger figure in the American legal profession. He was a trial lawyer and an appellate lawyer, a corporate lawyer, and a pro bono criminal defense lawyer. He wrote briefs, he delivered spellbinding oral arguments. He caught the eye of major figures who advanced him up the American legal ladder. Benjamin Cardozo, the chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals, sponsored Jackson for admission to the American Law Institute, an elite organization of American lawyers. And when the rest of the board said, Jackson from Jamestown, we've never heard of him, Cardozo, the sponsor, said, oh, you will. Jackson also was a Democrat. And during the 20 years when he's rising in American legal practice, he's not particularly politically active, but he's from New York State. And in the late 1920s, when his acquaintance, Franklin Roosevelt, fighting polio and off the scene for years, comes back to run for governor of New York, Jackson is pulled into political support activity. Proxy campaign speaking, consulting with the campaign, then when Roosevelt's elected, appointed tasks in Albany, but all part-time. And he's a part of Roosevelt's re-election in 1930, and then he's a part of Roosevelt's presidential campaign, which succeeds in 1932. Jackson is happy with his life in Western New York. He's prosperous. He has a big boat on Chautauqua Lake. He has an 88-acre horse farm. He has a house with white pillars. He has clients that make real products, and so his income is depression-proof, if you will. But he also has this lure to public service, and so he decides to briefly serve in Washington, to put his practice on hold, and to contribute perhaps 6 months to the New Deal. Well, it turns out that he never leaves. He's appointed by Roosevelt to 5 different jobs which require Senate confirmation. The first is the general counsel of the Revenue Bureau in the U.S. Department of Treasury. The second is Assistant Attorney General of the United States, and first he heads the Tax Division and then the Antitrust Division. The third is the Solicitor General of the United States, the principal advocate of the U.S. government before the U.S. Supreme Court. The fourth is the Attorney General of the United States, the principal law enforcement officer. And the fifth is Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And by the time all of that has happened, we're in the summer of 1941, and Robert Jackson is 49 years old. Thus, why does Harry Truman, just 4 years later, reach for this Supreme Court justice to lawyer and take on this project, which is the Moscow, Yalta, etc. commitment? Well, it's because Truman's hands are very full, and because he needs America's leading legal figure, including to get the UK and the USSR to comparably staff it from their sides. Now, this is a fishing trip. You see Roosevelt on the right, you see Jackson 2 down from him. This is before Jackson's in the cabinet. I just want to show you, in case anyone here is a fisherman, how well-dressed fishermen were in 1935. I bet you're not so well attired when you take to the water and put a line in the water today. You also don't notice behind the nonchalant smile and the gripping hand that Roosevelt needs that post to remain upright because he's got braces on his withered legs that hold him up as a victim of polio. This is Jackson on the cover of an American News Weekly magazine in 1935. He's arguing a major constitutional case and is becoming a figure of national attention. This is the Supreme Court that Jackson begins to argue before, and you notice on the back row left with the shock of white hair, former Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, Benjamin Cardozo, has become a U.S. Supreme Court Justice in the meantime. And Jackson argues almost 45 cases before this court in a 2-year period, brilliantly. Cardozo on the back row, Brandeis in the front row with the more unruly hair, said that Jackson should be Solicitor General for life. He was such a spellbinding advocate. But of course, Roosevelt had other designs and made him Attorney General, and then here in 41 appoints him to be a Supreme Court Justice. And there he is in his robes, a role in which he was very happy. I want to focus on one spot because it connects to the Holocaust. It's an anniversary this month. In the spring of 1943, in other words, 75 years ago, almost to the day, the Supreme Court is considering a case about the religious and conscientious scruples of Jehovah's Witness school children whose biblical beliefs teach them not to bow down before graven images. And thus their state public schools compel them to pledge allegiance and to salute the American flag. But they refuse, which leads them to be expelled from school, which leads their parents to be prosecuted for their children not attending school, a real whipsaw maneuver there, and which leads them to litigate a Supreme Court case, West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barrett. In that case, the court reconsidered its decision of just a couple of years earlier, the Gobaitis decision, which had upheld that kind of compulsory flag salute in the name of patriotism, that the government could compel citizens to unify through rituals like the Pledge of Allegiance and the salute of the flag. Jackson wasn't on the court when the Gobaitis decision case was decided. He is on the court as Barrett is being argued and considered and voted, and it's assigned to him to write the opinion. And in April of 1943, as Jackson's drafting that opinion, one which becomes one of his most enduring, eloquent, famous opinions, you can read it and you can tell he's reading the newspapers, because tucked into that opinion are numerous phrases that can't be about anything other than the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He refers to the unanimity of the graveyard. He refers to totalitarian powers like we see in Europe. He refers to oppressions of people on the basis of their religion, on the basis of perceived otherness that are contextually informed. Now, how well informed and how comprehending? Not very much, which is typical of what Washington and its distance and its comprehension was in 1943. But a bit of, and a developing bit of understanding in that Barrett case, in that opinion, connects to this job which Jackson takes on at Truman's appointment just 2 years earlier. This is Jackson at the Supreme Court when his appointment is announced publicly on May 2, 1945. He's got a little bit of a wry smile, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but maybe one can see a dawning realization that he has signed up as a patriot because his country and his president has asked, because it fell during the Supreme Court summer recess, but an enormous and unprecedented project. And by the way, he already knows here, it's just a week after Truman has privately recruited him, that the deal and the job has changed fundamentally. Prosecute Adolf Hitler is not the job anymore. Hitler has committed suicide. And we will soon learn that Bormann, although tried in absentia, is never going to be found, and Himmler is gone, and etc. And the international agreement about how to do this has not really been worked out. The generalities of Moscow and Yalta don't have much underneath them. And the gathering of evidence of what these Nazi perpetrators have done has not really been done. Needs to, of course, follow the peace and then the review and the work in different facilities to get German documents and to interview captured people and so forth. So Jackson knows that he's got a real handful in this task. He begins to consult people who can assist him and educate him. And I focus on this man, not, I think, a well-known face, but a name you should know and a story you should study. His name is Jacob Robinson. He's a Jew. He's a leader of the World Jewish Congress, and he had somehow the ability to be transiting the Atlantic a lot during the last years of the war and was in New York in June of 1945. Robert Jackson travels to New York to meet with Robinson and other leaders of the American Jewish community to basically say, I've got this assignment, and a big piece of it is what Hitler and the Nazis have done to the Jews of Europe. Help me. What do you know? What does this involve? And Jacob Robinson and his colleagues tell Jackson, this involves the systematic extermination of almost 6 million Jews. And Robert Jackson, in the federal building, Foley Square, in New York City, is rocked by that assertion. It's an enormous number that is way beyond anything he had ever heard or contemplated, and of course is beyond any previous exterminationist event in human history that he's aware of. And he asked Robinson, what is that based on? And Robinson says, well, it's a mathematical calculation. The census data of Jews in pre-war Europe and the UNRWA DP camp census data now, after the war, with ordinary demographic assumptions built in, show a missing increment of how many Jews there were and still should be and how many Jews there now still are. And what's missing is that almost 6 million lives. The only explanation can be that they have perished, and the only explanation can be that they were murdered by the Nazis. And Jackson said that is the start of an incredibly powerful, important assumption that, of course, requires evidence before it can become the basis of a prosecution. Help me. And Robinson comes to the Supreme Court the next Monday when they're both in Washington and delivers a pile of documents which begin to be the help and becomes an important consultant, de facto a member of Jackson's prosecution staff through the Nuremberg trial. And when we get to the trial, you'll see how the assertion, even by November of 1945, is backed up by evidence. But first, the plan has to be worked out. And so this is a blurry, I apologize, picture of a building at Westminster Abbey called Church House. It's in one of the side yards. It's a beautiful building, and you can see its peace and grandeur today. You don't see a plaque on the front of that building which notes what happened there in the summer of 1945. It should have such a plaque. It has a plaque indicating various UNESCO heritage treatment and Kofi Annan, etc., but nothing about the conference. In this building, in this room, in the summer of 1945, the four Allied powers, US, UK, USSR, plus the new French Republic, negotiate around a square table how they will do this together. This is the international commitment of Moscow and Yalta and the spring of 1945 to hold the Nazis legally accountable. What's defined to make this manageable is which Nazis we're talking about. We are talking about the leadership. We are talking about the arch criminals who were the policymakers who led to all the perpetration, whose crimes are not located in any particular location. A committer of an atrocity in a spot has created venue in some sovereign that can hold them accountable and prosecute in that spot. A Warsaw trial, a Krakow trial, an Auschwitz trial, a Dachau trial, etc. But at the level of arch criminals, their crimes transcend geography. And that's who these allies are planning to hold accountable. You see on the right side of the table, Jackson in the bow tie. On his far side is his deputy, General Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS. You see facing the camera, the UK representatives. The big fellow in the middle is a former rugby star named Khaki Roberts, Jeffrey Dorling Roberts, who was leading the negotiations on this day and handled much of the day-to-day work because of governmental turnover and complexities in the UK, which I'll come back to. On the left side, you see the French, and they were participants. The fellow with the glasses is Robert Falco, who was their lead negotiator and later became the lead French judge at Nuremberg. But they were definitely the fourth of the four parties, the smallest staff and the least dug in on a particular plan. And the backs to the camera are the USSR. And if you will, the US and the UK versus the USSR is what this negotiation is about. You see, the Soviet idea is that we have agreed, Moscow, Yalta, etc., that these people are arch criminals. So yes, of course we will try them together before we execute them. That's what we do with arch criminals. And the American-British due process model says, no, we suspect they're arch criminals. We believe we have jurisdiction over them. We believe there are legal norms to apply to them. But the point of a process is to deliver evidence to an independent tribunal, which will decide if we've carried the burden of proof that these are arch criminals. And only if they're convicted and then sentenced by the tribunal, not by the governments or the prosecutors, will it be appropriate for them to be punished. In other words, fair trial, show trial. And that process is a long, hard, repetitive discussion that is all transcribed and is fascinating to read during the summer of 1945. Simultaneously, the big three have this summit meeting at Potsdam. This is a different three than Yalta, of course, and Stalin must have looked to his right, looking for Churchill, looking for Roosevelt, and thought, who are these people? He briefly did have Churchill here at Potsdam, but the UK had an election in July of 1945, and by the time the ballots, including the absentee military ballots, were counted, Churchill and the unity cabinet of the war, the conservative government, had fallen. And so the fellow on the left, as we look at the photo, Clement Attlee of the Labour Party, is the new prime minister and literally switches in for Churchill during the middle of the Potsdam Conference. And of course, Harry Truman is the new American president. And behind Stalin, you see Molotov. And behind Truman, you see James Burns, the new American Secretary of State. Among many topics that they're discussing at Potsdam is what's being negotiated at London. On the side of Potsdam, the American conversations include Robert Jackson, who has come over to consult with Truman and with Burns and with Undersecretary of War John McCloy and others to basically say we're at a standoff with the USSR. What am I to do? What are my orders? Am I to blow this up? Or am I to participate in a show trial process? And Jackson is basically told, do what you think is right. And so Jackson goes back to London and basically holds his ground and says, I'm a lawman. Backed up by the Potsdam Agreement, which is Stalin basically signing on to and communicating instructions to his USSR delegation to go the American-British way with regard to this plan. And so in early August 8, 1945, they sign an agreement which creates the world's first international criminal court. Jackson in the middle with the pen, to his left, Robert Falco, the French representative. To his right, Lord Jowett, the British Lord Chancellor. Off screen is the USSR signatory. This tribunal, this four-nation court, is created to have jurisdiction over four crimes: the common planning or conspiracy, the waging of aggressive war, the starting it crime, the breach of peace crime, the commission of war crimes in breach of Hague Conventions and pre-existing treaties, and a new concept called crimes against humanity, never previously embodied in a declaration or a treaty and never previously prosecuted, which in its breadth, at least as initially drafted, encompasses intra-state behavior of governments against citizens. In other words, German treatment of Germans because they were Jews during the 1930s. Now, very quickly, the breadth of that concept causes the Allies to backpedal and in October they, by correcting a punctuation glitch, narrow that reading, and at Nuremberg generally crimes against humanity get folded into the war-fighting years, so not 33 through 39, but 39 through 45. This is a face you do know. This is Adolf Eichmann. He's the head of the Jewish office in the Reich-Main Security Office in the government in Berlin, and for basically the duration of the war. The operational significance of this office is that Hitler to Himmler, to this office headed by Eichmann, is the responsibility to carry out the so-called final solution of the Jewish question, which means as the German troops have come east and conquered this land, and these extermination camps have been set up, the supervisory managerial office and authority is Eichmann. This is a letter to Jackson during that summer of 1945 from Jacob Robinson, his advisor, his consultant. This is a month after their first New York meeting. This is a part of the communication. And one of the things that this letter is alerting Jackson to is that the proposed lists of defendants that are starting to be circulated and publicized are missing a key name. Robinson writes, it's a great disappointment not to find, I'm sorry that the print is so small, the name of, I'm in the second paragraph, the head of section 4B, referent Judenfrage, expert in Jewish questions. His name is sometimes spelled Eichmann, Karl Eichmann, Ingo Eichmann, Wilhelm Eichmann, and Willi, and goes on to detail who this man is. This is the particular paragraph which spells out the responsibility of this person. In other words, what the Nazis had perpetrated at the arch-criminal level, which is part of the responsibility and this project, includes this topic of Holocaust and this responsibility of the Jewish office and the extermination camp system, which they're only beginning to understand. But you see the forward progress. This is another document that comes to one of Jackson's very important deputies, John Harlan Amen, from the State Department from the War Department in August of 1945. Subject Eichmann, and subject another fellow, Hans Kurl, and says the War Department will be sending you information on these people. Now, the name and the role and the responsibility becomes more concrete, but the person is believed to be dead. All surviving witnesses indicate that he committed suicide. There's no trace of him. And so Eichmann and this office at the charging point drops out. He is not a Nuremberg defendant. How do we get to Nuremberg? Well, because there is no more Germany and because the Allies have to locate this project created by the London Agreement, and they agree that the headquarters will be in Berlin, but the first, which turns out to be the only trial, will occur in Nuremberg. The main reason is because Nuremberg is in this area shaded blue, the American sector of occupation. The Americans, for reasons of security and resources and, frankly, control, wanted this trial in their sector of occupation, not in the British sector to the northeast, to the northwest, that's the yellow, nor in the French sector, which is the red, white, and blue stripes, and obviously not in the pink-shaded Soviet sector. And so they go to scout Nuremberg, which also has, of course, the echoes, the kind of comeuppance echoes of Nuremberg rallies and Nuremberg laws, and find that although the city has been horribly bombed, this structure is largely intact. It is the Palace of Justice on the Furtstrasse that connects the city of Nuremberg to the next city, Fürth. And the courthouse building in the front is backed by the wheel and spoke structure, which is a large prison. And that's where they decide, and the Allies agree, to hold this proceeding. The 4 windows you see in the upper level are courtroom 600. That is the room where the Nuremberg trial occurs, and you can see the roof repairs and the American military occupation vehicles that are part of securing the courthouse. This is a team that I want to focus on for a moment. It's Jackson's interrogation division. You see, during this fall of 1945, after the court is created, after the site is selected, they're drafting an indictment and considering the names and what about Eichmann, but there is no Eichmann, and they're gathering and analyzing the evidence. And much of it is captured documents, but some of it is interrogation based on people who have come into Allied hands, many into American and British hands. And they're first in Luxembourg, and then they're brought to Nuremberg, and they're interrogated by this team headed by the man at the desk, John Harlan Amen. His name was on the memo I showed you earlier. He's an important lawyer through this whole trial on Jackson's staff. He had been a prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York, an American local prosecutor of Murder Incorporated, the American gangland killing machine that had operated with impunity in Brooklyn in the 1930s into 1940. And that's very relevant to what particularly these crimes against humanity ideas are about what the Nazis did. Gangland killers, and an experienced prosecutor who handled that in Brooklyn is the man to deal with gangland killers on the continent of Europe. And what Eamon and his team do is begin to interrogate them to learn about what happened. Two particularly important people who they interrogate and learn a lot from before the trial ever starts are Otto Ohlendorf, who was an underling to Hermann Goering and was the head of the Einsatzgruppe in operation, Einsatzgruppe B, who tells them what these mobile killing teams have done in the East without remorse and without sparing details. Another person is Dieter Wislicenny, who is an underling, a deputy to Eichmann in the Jewish office in Berlin. And what Wislicenny describes is the orders for the final solution. And that one time when he had qualms, Eichmann reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the document that Dr. Katz, and other Holocaust experts, of course, inevitably will find, but it doesn't exist yet. But it is the Hitler order. And Eichmann has it in his desk drawer, wrapped in a red ribbon, and shows it to Wislicenny so that Wislicenny will have no qualms about riding hard the camps and the operators and the underlings who are reporting up the chain of supervision through him to Eichmann. Those people are both prisoners, and they're both interrogated, and they're both very forthcoming before the trial starts. This is Eamon interrogating Rudolf Hess, also in that time period, who becomes the number 2 defendant. This is the courtroom as the trial begins, courtroom 600, in November of 1945. The defendants, 21 in the box, are on the right. Their attorneys are in front of them. The judges are out of the picture on the high bench to the left, and their assistants are in front of them, and then 5 tables of prosecutors. This is a color photo that begins to zoom in, and you see Jackson leaning on his hand to the right of the podium, and you see his British counterpart, Lord Hartley Shawcross, leaning on his hand to the left of the podium. I focus on Hartley Shawcross for a couple of reasons. He was a brilliant lawyer and a great contributor as the British chief prosecutor. He also was the Attorney General of Attlee's new Labour government, so he had a full-time and more job in London during this trial process, which required him to hop back and forth quite a bit. It required him also to be what Americans would call, if not something we're able to do, bipartisan, and to entrust his deputy, the conservative David Maxwell Fyfe, to be a day-to-day head of British trial work here in Nuremberg. And finally, Lord Shawcross's son, William Shawcross, is here in the room and will be speaking to us this afternoon. These are the judges, 2 from each nation. They were to function as a judge and an alternate in the event of illness, but no judge became ill, and in effect, they function as a court of 8. The president judge is Judge Geoffrey Lawrence of the UK. He's the baldest head in the middle. There are contenders for the baldest man, but I think Lawrence wins it. And to the left of him is Norman Burkett, who was the British alternate. To the right, as we see it, of Lawrence, a slightly less bald head is Francis Biddle, former U.S. Attorney General, the American Chief Judge. And to the right of him, in front of the American flag, is Judge John Parker of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Fourth Circuit, who is the American alternate, and the French judges on the right and the Russian judges on the left. This is Jackson at the prosecutor table, and this is Jackson at the podium. The trial begins on November 20, 1945, with the reading of the indictment, and then the next day with Jackson's opening statement. And in his opening statement, he, in effect, reiterates what Jacob Robinson had told him 5 months earlier. He says the evidence will show that the Nazis, among many crimes, planned and implemented the systematic extermination of almost 6 million Jews. And what will this case be based on? It will be based on captured documents, and it will be based on perpetrator witnesses who tell the story. This is Hartley Shawcross, who, because of the domestic responsibilities, opened his part of the case in December, a few weeks later, and you see Jackson seated behind him. These are the defendants in the box, Hermann Goering on the left, and Hess and Ribbentrop. I want to focus on, I had him, I have to spot him again, Hans Frank, who I'm not spotting, actually. But I mention him here in Krakow because Hans Frank, former Minister of Justice in the Third Reich, then became the Governor General of the general government, the occupied land here in Poland, and lived and presided just down the hill and left at the river in the Wawel Castle. A beautiful place of peace today and history today, which is horror for what happened and what was presided over by this official who was held accountable at Nuremberg. Jackson, in his opening statement, referred to Hans Frank particularly and then added a little interjection. He said, "Who I regret to say is a lawyer." And I think that phrase connects very directly to what this program is about today. This is one of the defendants, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was part of the Reich Security Office, was in a supervisory role that included these camps, a Gestapo defendant who claimed no knowledge of the perpetration of extermination, and whose defense attorney did a tremendous favor to history. But first, Ohlendorf. This is Ohlendorf testifying in the American case in January of 1946 about the work of the Einsatzgruppe. He's questioned by John Harlan Amen. He does the direct examination based on the interrogations, and you can see a camp that is on the chart right behind him. It is the Farben factory at Auschwitz. In other words, what is discovered and what are people beginning to comprehend as a function of this trial is this enormous reality that brings us here today. This is Wisła on the witness stand. He's questioned by a junior lawyer. Amen made a slight mistake. He didn't quite understand how important Wisła's testimony was, and so he let an underling handle this one. And Wisła tells the story of Eichmann and the Jewish office and the Hitler order through Himmler that he witnessed and what these camps were in the killing area. And this is a third witness who I want to look at. This is in his, if you will, salad days. Rudolf Höss. Not Hess, the defendant, Höss, H-O-E-S-S. He was the commandant of Auschwitz for the bulk of its existence. And here you see him in his uniform and his decorations and his relaxed, debonair air. His job was to run this slave labor, but largely extermination facility. And he did it very effectively. He lived in the villa, for those who were on the march yesterday. It was just behind the barracks at Auschwitz I, and you could see it over the wall. He ultimately met his fate when, after being imprisoned by the Allies, he was turned over to the Poles. He was tried in Auschwitz because his crime had a venue, and then he was hanged on the wooden platform that you might have seen because it's preserved in Auschwitz I when we were there yesterday. This is Höss on the witness stand at Nuremberg. You see, he'd been a fugitive too, like Eichmann, whose fugitivity lasted much longer. But Höss was captured by the British in the winter of 1946. And the notification went to the Allies and to the Defense Council. And a number of people said, bring him to Nuremberg. We want to interrogate him. And so he was interrogated by Amen and interrogation team and by British counterparts and made available to defense attorneys. And Höss, without remorse, described his work as the commandant of Auschwitz. I say without remorse, there is a human dimension. I hate to even say human in his context, but there is an odd dimension to what he says. He pads his numbers. You see, it seems he was a little embarrassed that he hadn't exterminated all the Jews that had come into Auschwitz and been in his custody. He'd left the task incomplete by January of 1945 when the camp was closed and destroyed. And so he exaggerated, and he used a number over 2 million. Holocaust scholars now know that and teach us that the number of murders at Auschwitz are below that 2 million number. But Höss, in his affidavit and then on the witness stand, tells what Auschwitz was and what Auschwitz did. And he's on the witness stand because although captured and brought to Nuremberg after the prosecutors have rested their case, Kaltenbrunner's defense attorney, Dr. Kaufman, calls Höss to testify as a defense witness. Now you might think, what value would that have? It sounds a disastrous witness for the defense. But there was a small fact that Hearst did testify, and may even be true, that he never saw Kaltenbrunner in Auschwitz. Okay. That comes in, and then Kaufman introduces the affidavit, which of course is the full story of Auschwitz, and then turns him over to cross-examination. And John Harlan Amon's cross-examination of Hearst in April of 1946 is the full story spoken in the evidentiary record for the world to hear, for the press to cover, for publicity to teach to the world of what Auschwitz had been and what Hearst as commandant had done. By the end of the trial process in the summer of 1946, Jackson has been away from the Supreme Court for a year, and that's controversial and undesirable. He hands off subsequent trial responsibility to this deputy, Telford Taylor, a very fine lawyer who had been an important part of trying the high command in the initial case. And Taylor presides as the American chief counsel over 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials. Those are only American trials because the alliance fractures, and there is no second or any more international trial. There are Russian trials and British trials and French trials and American trials that occur in this sector. And they include the trial of Ohlendorf. The witness is now a defendant in the Einsatzgruppen case. And it includes the slave labor cases. It includes the industrialist cases. It includes the lawyers and judges perverting law case, the Altstatter case, which is portrayed in the film Judgment at Nuremberg. And this Nuremberg trial process continues for a total of 3+ years. 13 cases, 1 international and 12 subsequent American trials. It produces an evidentiary record. This is one of the 42 volumes of the published international trial record, published in multiple languages, Russian, French, German, English, and widely distributed. And what's in this record is the evidentiary basis to begin to understand and build on and do the historiography and do the teaching and study for all the decades since to be where we are in understanding the Holocaust. This is Taylor at the podium, and this is one of his deputies who was a chief counsel in the Einsatzgruppe case, Ben Ferenz, who today is the last living podium prosecutor at Nuremberg. You see, on top of Ohlendorf's testimony and the record in the international trial that allowed understanding of the Einsatzgruppe, Ben Ferenz located the records, which are basically murder receipts, and brought a stack of these to Taylor and said, you know, these documents demand their own prosecution. And that leads to Taylor saying, well, you do it, and Ferenz saying, okay, despite the fact that he'd never tried a case in his life. And so at age 26, he tries and very successfully brings what's probably the largest murder trial in American history, in world history. And then this is what becomes of Nuremberg. This is the Cold War. This is a blank slide. But this is the end of the 1940s. You see this looking backwards, and this accountability process becomes off message in the Western Alliance, celebrating joint endeavors with the USSR, picking on Germany is not the objective now when the USSR is the threat and the nascent West German state as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism is the American and British, etc. priority. And so Telford Taylor is told to wrap it up. And the last trial, the Ministries case, concludes in the spring of 1949. And the international accountability process for Nazi crimes internationally ceases. The domestic accountability process proceeds very fitfully. A little bit of German activity in the 1950s. Of course, heroic Israeli activity, the Eichmann case most prominently in 1961. German cases, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the early 1960s brought by Fritz Bauer. And in modern times, with an expanded theory of accomplice liability, the handful of proceedings against the very aged participants who were part of a murderous machine. This is a glimpse of the Eichmann case. This is Gabriel Bach, who survives today, a former Israeli Supreme Court justice who was a lead prosecutor on that case and gave a powerful interview as part of a March of the Living Miller Center endeavor and program, and is on the website. And notice in front of him what's on the table. It's one of the Nuremberg books with Bach's tabs in it. In other words, what were the Nuremberg evidentiary documents important to? Eichmann, and everything that has followed. That's another picture of the prosecution table at the Eichmann case. But my point now is the fellow at the far right. Bach is second to the right. The fellow leaning on his hand, and maybe that's my theme, Jackson, Shawcross, and now this fellow, is Jacob Robinson. Jacob Robinson of the World Jewish Congress. Jacob Robinson of Foley Square in June 1945, saying almost 6 million. Jacob Robinson of the U.S. prosecution team. Jacob Robinson, de facto, of the Israeli prosecution team here in the Eichmann case. And this is the dawning comprehension that Robert Jackson takes home, and the world takes home, if you will. And I want to close with one document that shows the place it had in the remainder of Jackson's life. He died in 1954, so he didn't live very long. Hartley Shawcross did live very long. A number of others lived very long. But of course, the Nuremberg generation, like any great heroic generation, hands off to successors. Jackson, before he handed off, spends a fair amount of time dictating and then editing and then sending this fairly careful reply to a letter he had received from a stranger. His name is W. Jefferson Davis, and for Americans, just chuckle at that one. He lives in Ramona, California, and he wrote Justice Jackson in 1953 because he'd read a press account of a speech that Jackson had given to a bar association in which Jackson had referred to 6 million Jews having been exterminated by the Nazis. And Mr. Davis writes, what's the basis for that? In other words, he's at least a Holocaust doubter. Holocaust isn't the word yet, but he's a 6 million doubter or denier. And Jackson writes back a letter that goes on for a page and a half. And I focus you on the second paragraph. Jackson writes, of course it's not possible to give exact figures, but I think the estimate of 6 million people put to death by the Nazi regime is justified. Wilhelm Hertel of the Nazi Security Service furnished evidence that Adolf Eichmann, who had charge of the extermination program, told them that about 4 million, et cetera, et cetera. Hirsch, commandant of the Auschwitz camp, which was only one of many, estimated that at least 2.5 million, the padded number, were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning. And then this is Jackson's close of his letter to a stranger, but a document that he felt had to go out into the world so that this man's views would not go unanswered. Jackson wrote, when you say that my statement is not supported by the evidence, it must be that you are not familiar with the transcript of the proceedings of evidence taken at the Nuremberg trial, which is published in 42 volumes, including as exhibits the original reports of many of these extermination projects or the translated documents published by this government. In other words, these are facts. These are facts established by the Nuremberg process. These are facts there to study and learn by anyone who will take the time and bring the intellectual honesty to consider them. And so here we are on the March of the Living and in Poland, 70 and more years down from the Nuremberg trials, at a time when 13,000 of us gather and see and witness and understand and study and go back to teach what we understand. In a world where still way too many people are in the W. Jefferson Davis camp. And what the March of the Living is about, if I may, is answering Mr. Davis, is teaching Mr. Davis, is teaching the grandchildren of Mr. Davis what this atrocity, man against man, was about. Immoral, real, enormous, criminal, and globally prescribed by the legal precedents established at Nuremberg. Thank you very much.